In the previous video, we went through the installation process for the IMX IP PBX system. In this video, we will do the initial configuration for our system by using IMX Admin, the web administration tool for IMX. We start by opening the browser and going to the same IP address that was presented to us when the server installation was finished. In our case, the IP address was 192.168.119.215. If you get a security warning like this one in your browser, don't worry. All you have to do is to add an exception for the certificate from the server. The login page for IMX Admin also has a link to the administration manual. The manual provides a more detailed coverage about all the features and settings found in IMX Admin. The default username for IMX Admin is administrator. The password is also the same, administrator. The first time you log in, you can see some information about the system version and build date at the top. This page also provides links to the documentation for the IMX client applications. Notice the warning at the bottom of the screen, indicating that we need to complete the initial install wizard in order to have access to the other menus in IMX Admin. Click in the initial install menu to start the configuration. The first step is to license the IMX server. Every IMX installation has a unique personal key that needs to be sent to eTellicom when buying a license. We then click the Browse button to load the license file that was sent by eTellicom. Click the Apply button when you are done and the license will be loaded. In the Follow screen, we can see all the licensed features and the respective values from the license file. We click Next to proceed to the next step. The next page, we are allowed to change the date, the system clock, and the time zone for the system. The IMX server is configured to automatically synchronize the system clock via the network time protocol. This protocol allows the server to always have the system clock up to date, as long as it has an active internet connection. It is recommended to use this automatic mode rather than changing the time manually, so the server time is always synchronized correctly. We didn't change anything here, so we just click Next to proceed. Now we have to apply the global settings for the telephony system. We first need to select the country. Select the appropriate country in the country selection list. Notice how the codes and values change accordingly as you select a different country. If your country is not listed, just select the closest match, since this is only used for playing the tones. In my case, I will select Australia. Make sure that the country code is correct. We also enter the national code, which is usually 0. Next, we enter the area code. In my case, this is 3. The trunk access code is the prefix for making external calls. I will leave as the default 0. It's also required to enter the global calling number for outbound calls. This is the number that will be presented to external parties when making outbound calls from the IMX system. It's also possible to configure the system to live record all the calls. Just keep in mind that depending on the number of calls you have in your system, this will use a lot of hard drive space. We click the Apply button to apply our change, and then we click Next to proceed. IMX uses the Session Initiation Protocol, or SIP for short, which is an open standard for telecommunications. The visibility of the SIP module for the IMX server is dictated by the domain name. By default, the domain name is the current local IP address for the IMX server, which is specified by this double $sign variable. Usually the default value is okay, but if you want to have your IMX server working with your own DNS infrastructure, then you should enter the appropriate domain name for the IMX server here. The SIP standard also uses the RTP protocol to establish audio and video streams. The IMX server will reserve a range of 1000 UDP ports for RTP media. This range is enough for up to 500 simultaneous calls. If your IMX server is going to be used behind a router or firewall, it's very important to forward that same range of ports from your public network interface to the IMX server, so external providers and remote extensions can properly establish audio and video streams. The IMX server provides three specific SIP profiles. The first one is intended for internal SIP extensions. The second one is used for external SIP providers. And the third profile is for external SIP extensions connecting remotely to the IMX server. The first one, the internal profile, is the interface for SIP extensions connected to the IMX via the local network. In this page, we can configure the settings for the internal profile. The default port for the internal profile is 5080. The public IP address is the interface where IMX will expect connections for this profile. So, for example, if I wanted to connect a SIP phone from my local network to the IMX server, I would use the IP address 192.168.119.215 for the server address, and for the port I would use 5080. Please keep these settings in mind when you are configuring your phones in your local network. It is recommended to not change these values for the internal profile. To proceed without changing anything, we just click Next. The next page shows the settings for the external SIP profile. This profile is used to establish connections between external SIP providers and the IMX server. The default port is 5060, which is the established standard port for SIP. Notice that the public IP address has the prefix STUN. STUN is a network protocol that helps to determine the public IP address for computers and other devices that are located behind a router or firewall. By default, IMX will use STUN in order to find the public IP address of the network router, so it can communicate with external SIP providers. While STUN works fine, it is recommended to use IMX with a static public IP address, and then enter that IP address in the public address field for the external profile. If your internet connection does not have a static IP address, you can leave the default value in the public address field. So IMX uses STUN to determine the public IP address every time it needs to communicate with the SIP provider. It's also important to remember to forward this port 5060 from your internet router to the IMX server. The third and last SIP profile, which is used for external extensions connecting to the IMX server, is not configured by the initial install, so we just click Next to go to the next step. In the next step, we can create a range of extensions. Up to 1000 extensions can be created using this form. For my IMX, I will create 50 extensions, ranging from 300 up to 349. We can also create an associated DID range here, but that will be covered in another video. For the extension type, I will use extension, which is the extension type for SIP phones. We will cover other extension types in another video. We will leave the Create Users checkbox enabled, so IMX will also create the associated users for the new extension range. You can specify a single SIP password for all the extensions being created, but make sure that you enter a strong password, especially if your IMX server will be allowing external extensions to connect. If you leave the SIP password field empty, IMX will create a random password for each extension. I'll leave my SIP password field empty, so IMX will create the random passwords for me. Next, we hit Apply, so the range can be created. In the next page, we can see the new extensions that IMX has just created. If we click on the Show Passwords button, the grid will display the random passwords assigned to each extension. If we need to create more extensions, we can click on the New Extension or New Range buttons. Since we are done with the extensions, we can click Next to go to the final step. In the final step, we are presented with the VoIP Provider wizard. This wizard is used to configure IMX with the account and connection details for your SIP provider. It will also automatically create the respective gateway, inbound route, and least cost route or LCR for your provider. We will discuss about gateways, inbound routes, and LCR in more details in another video. The VoIP Provider wizard comes with a predefined list of templates for some providers, which contains the default values for those providers. Selecting the appropriate provider from the list will fill the most common fields with noun values for that particular provider. If your SIP provider is not listed, just select the template named Example, and then enter the required fields with the values provided by your SIP provider. In the Provider field, just enter a descriptive name for your provider. In the Realm field, you need to enter the SIP domain name informed by your provider. You will also need to enter your login and password as informed by your SIP provider. The Register field indicates if your provider requires your SIP account to be registered with their server. This is set to yes most of the time. In the next field, we need to specify the IP addresses or subnetworks from the provider so they can be inserted to the access control list in IMX. This is required because by default, IMX works in a very secure configuration. IMX will reject any external calls that originate from a network that is not allowed in the access control list. This prevents malicious attacks from breaching the IMX server and make fraudulent calls. So, in order to accept calls from the provider, it's required to enter a list of IP addresses or subnetworks in a comma-separated list in this field. If you don't know those values, you can either ask your provider or just enter the local host IP address 127.0.0.1/32 and then look at the ACL warnings log later so you can include the denied IP addresses in the ACL list. We will talk about the ACL warnings and ACL lists in another occasion. In this case, I will just enter the subnet for my local network. The Inbound Default Extension field indicates which extension should receive the inbound calls from this provider by default. You can select any of the extensions created previously. It's also possible to change this extension in the inbound route configuration for the provider later. The Inbound Use Gateway field indicates if IMX should use the gateway for this provider in order to recognize the calls. The default value, yes, is recommended. The Outbound Access Code value is the prefix to be used when selecting this provider to make outbound calls. Usually, this will be the same as the trunk access code configured in the global settings. The Outbound Use Gateway field indicates if IMX should use the gateway for this provider when making outbound calls. We can usually leave the default value, yes. We can click on the Advanced checkbox to display more advanced values. Those values will not be covered by this video. Then, we click the Apply button to load the provider configuration into IMX. Since this is the final step for the initial configuration, we click the Finish button. After the initial install is completed, IMX admin will unlock all the menus, and the IMX is now ready for basic use, including making and receiving phone calls. In the next video, we will discuss about some of the most common menus in IMX admin. Thanks for watching.